First of all, Brendan is a veteran speaker at our UBC Oceans to Fisheries Quantitative Seminar. I think giving talks at least twice previously. Is that right, Brendan? He's on mute now, so.
Yeah, just once, as far as I recall.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I thought, okay, just once, but still, that's enough to qualify you as a veteran. Did a PhD in ecology at SFU, completed 2011, and did a BSc in biology with distinctions at UVic, completing 2004. Since 2021, Brendan's been a research scientist in the salmon assessment section of DFO, based in the lovely town of Sydney at the Institute of Ocean Sciences. Prior to that, 2018 till 2021, research biologist with DFO. Brendan's an adjunct professor at SFU and member of several supervisory committees. Prior to that, Brendan was a quantitative fisheries ecologist and research biologist with ESSA Technologies here in Vancouver. And Brendan's been a great contemporary contributor to the literature on Pacific salmon ecology. He's co-authored 37 peer-reviewed journal articles and many other publications. And with that, I'll put it over to Brendan.
Great. Well, thank you, Murdoch. I appreciate the the nice introduction and the invitation to talk today. I haven't been able to join as many of these seminars as I would have liked, but it's been great to be able to catch up with the recordings when the opportunity presents itself. Kids are sleeping, etc. So it's been awesome that you guys have been able to record these, and one of the kind of many small silver linings of the fact that we're all working remotely these days. So as the title says, today I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of my journey thinking about confronting trade-offs between salmon harvest and population diversity in mixed stock fisheries in large river basins. This is kind of going to be a 10,000 foot overview of a bit of my journey over the past 5 years. I'm going to totally gloss over a lot of the kind of math and technical details. But if I pique your interest, or if you want to call bullshit, please feel free to get in touch afterwards. And I'm always happy to talk about this stuff. Email address is here on the title slide. So before we get started, I do want to acknowledge kind of all the folks that I've leaned on and learned from over the years, and that kind of I'm drawing upon for the work that I'm going to be talking about today. I'm super grateful for kind of their time, ideas, clarity of thinking, without which most of this work would have not been possible. Though Kuskokwim, Chinook, and Kuskokwim Chinook fisheries are going to kind of feature at the tail end of my talk. In many ways, they're kind of where I got to dip my toe into thinking about these types of things. It kind of really all started with the Carl Walters Mafia, as Mike Jones likes to call them, who really introduced me to a lot of this thinking and have contributed to a lot of the work today. So a whole bunch of acknowledgements, co-authors and collaborators. In addition to them, I've benefited considerably from funding from the Arctic Yukon Kuskokwim Sustainable Salmon Initiative over the past 5 years that have supported a lot of the work that I'll be talking about. So my talk today is going to be a kind of a presentation with 3 acts, if you will. The first act is going to unpack what I specifically mean by salmon population diversity, make sure we're all on the same page with how I'm defining it, what I mean by it, why we might care about it, but also why it can make mixed stock fisheries management and thinking about trade-offs between harvest and diversity complicated. And I'll argue that patchy, imperfect data on the various dimensions of population diversity can be a real impediment to both understanding and managing for diversity in mixed stock fisheries. But then in Acts 2 and 3, I'm going to kind of dive into some specific examples and systems I've had an opportunity to work in, where I'll argue that kind of modern molecular tools and quantitative approaches can really help to overcome some of these challenges that have plagued thinking about diversity in mixed stock fisheries for a long time. So that's kind of an overview, a roadmap of where I'm hoping to take us today. And to get to the chase and leave you with what I'm hoping to kind of leave you with by the end of this, there's really kind of three broad take-home messages. And none of this is rocket science. In many ways, this is all kind of intuitive, but I think it helps unpack and clarify a lot of thinking around these issues. So the first is that large river basins across the Pacific Rim host high salmon population diversity. This diversity is important and it's beneficial for a number of reasons, but can also be hard to manage for, right? In particular, this diversity can lead to trade-offs in mixed stock fisheries that exploit fish, contribute to them. And those trade-offs can be really challenging to characterize in large river basins, particularly ones that are remote and where getting a handle of the diversity within them can be really challenging. And as a result, it can be really difficult to quantify the magnitude of trade-offs within those systems, and that can lead to conflict and challenges when it comes to fisheries management. And then lastly, I'll argue, as I said on the previous slide, that modern molecular and quantitative tools can both help, it can really help squeeze more insight out of these systems. They can help characterize both the extent and benefits of diversity, trade-offs with mixed stock harvest, and ultimately support kind of greater transparency in the evaluation of harvest policies within them. Okay, so Act 1. What exactly do I mean by salmon population diversity? Well, few taxa exhibit higher levels of intra-specific variation than Pacific salmon. I mean, they're just an incredible and wonderful species and species complex to think about when it comes to diversity. And this is, I'm sure, no surprise to anyone who's listening in on this presentation today. But before I get too far, I wanted to kind of define, for the purposes of this presentation, what specifically I mean by population diversity, which I think of as having at least 4 kind of key dimensions that I illustrate with this bubble stick river, if you will, on the left. The first and simplest dimension is simply variation in the number of individual populations within a system, within a large river basin, right? So this is richness. This is population richness instead of species richness, illustrated here in the Stick River with the various bubbles that are distributed throughout it. The second dimension of diversity is variation in the size of those individual populations. So we can think of this as evenness in the distribution of sizes, illustrated here by just the relative size of the different bubbles. Third, and particularly important for the presentation today and to thinking about trade-offs in mixed stock fisheries, is variation in the intrinsic productivity of individual populations, their propensity or ability to grow at small population sizes, which here is illustrated by variation in the colors across this hypothetical river basin. And then lastly, we can think of variation in a whole host of life history characteristics as being another dimension of salmon population diversity, which again, Pacific salmon characterize and illustrate really well. This could be differences in things like run timing, which is what I'm intending to highlight here with these kind of early, average, and late return timings for these populations. But it can also be a whole host of other life history characteristics like habitat use, migration routes, age at maturation, all of which give rise to heterogeneity or variability in how populations respond to the myriad environments that they interact with over the course of their life cycle. So we can think of this as like as response diversity and those variable responses to environmental conditions that ultimately give rise to weakly correlated dynamics in space and time. And that can be another key dimension of population diversity when we think about things like salmon. So now that I've touched upon what I mean by salmon population diversity, I want to just briefly touch upon the kind of classic ideas for why we might care about it, right? So why should we care about it? I mean, the first oft-cited reason is simply for its intrinsic value. That is, we should protect diversity for diversity's sake, right? And this sentiment or perspective is captured in all sorts of policies and goal statements or conventions. Our wild salmon policy here in Western Canada, aims to maintain diverse salmon populations for the benefit and enjoyment of people in Canada in perpetuity. I can never say that word right. Shouldn't have even tried. The Yukon Delta Refuge, which will feature in some of my later work that I'll be talking about today, explicitly states that one of their aims is to conserve fish and their natural diversity, of which salmon is a major part of that within the Delta Refuge. And then more broadly and more generally, we have global conventions like the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which states that conservation of biological diversity is also important. You'll note that in at least a couple of these quotes that I have up here, there are also nods to the benefits that diversity provides for humans. And that really leads into my second point about why we might care about salmon population diversity and care about thinking about it. So this leads into kind of really the second off-cited reason, which is because the benefits that we as humans derive from it, particularly stability and predictability in fisheries, arise from the diversity within the systems that are being exploited. Right? And the classic idea in thinking about this is this arises through fisheries that are harvesting across diverse population complexes, right? And when you do harvest across those diverse population complexes, the harvest and fishery yield tends to be more stable, right? And of course, this applies not only to salmon population diversity or fish population diversity within species, but also diversity among species more generally, right? So these plots here, which I'll walk through in a second, help illustrate the relationship between three dimensions of diversity that I highlighted earlier. Synchrony, and in this case, specifically pairwise correlation and recruitment deviations amongst populations, richness or the total number of stocks, or evenness amongst populations within a population complex. Here, evenness along the x-axis ranges from very low, this is just an index, Pilou index, but very low, which means really a single population contributes the overwhelming majority of production to a system, all the way to 1, where all populations within a complex are equal contributors. So what these plots illustrate is how stability in harvest, in this case 1 over the CV in harvest, vary as a function of these three different dimensions in a relatively simple age-structured multi-population simulation model that's subject to a mixed stock fishery that's managed with a MSY, aggregate MSY harvest policy. So the key thing that you see here, if we look over here on the left, is that as synchrony declines, so as the individual populations become less and less correlated in their dynamics, stability in harvest that integrates across those populations increases. And to a lesser extent, as richness increases within the population complex, stability also increases. Evenness also has a role to play in these simulations, though the magnitude of the evenness effect, that is, the more even the distribution of populations, the more stable the system is smaller than the influences of synchrony or richness. Now, this isn't rocket science. The synchrony observation here is exactly what we'd expect from the very large body of research that's shown kind of the classic portfolio effects in fisheries as well as in salmon systems, right? This is what we would expect based on the statistical averaging of weakly correlated dynamics. It's well documented. But nonetheless, this just highlights how these different dimensions of diversity contribute to one of a suite of different benefits we might think of being derived from systems, right? So the take home here is that rich, even population complexes with weakly synchronous dynamics make for greater stability in mixed stock harvest. The next reason why we might care about salmon population diversity has to do with idea of resilience and the concept that protecting diversity today makes a system more resilient to change tomorrow. That's because today's perhaps large contributors in a system may be less important tomorrow and vice versa. And a classic example from the world's largest commercial, currently, nowadays the largest commercial salmon fishery in the world, Bristol-based sockeye, is shown here. In this case, these are 4 different fishing districts across the Bristol Bay stock complex with commercial catch by district over time, going back over a century. And what you can see is that for over 80 years, the Naknek feedjack system contributed the lion's share of total harvest. It varied from year to year, but that was the major contributor to aggregate commercial catch within the system, sorry. But then in the mid 1970s, the Egagik system became a huge, relatively huge or large producer as a result of, at least in part, changing climate, resulting in changes in the timing of ice off in nursery lakes and lake phenology. So this, the Bristol Bay has been held up as a key kind of classic example of the importance of portfolio effects, maintaining a diverse portfolio to benefit tomorrow as well as today. Okay, and then lastly, the last reason we might care about salmon population diversity, at least for the purposes of the presentation today, but this is, I think important to some of the messages I'll be speaking to later, is thinking about equity and access to salmon in large river basins, right? Now, salmon population diversity kind of can help underpin food security and equity and access to and benefits from salmon, particularly in food insecure remote regions of large river basins. And so you can think of our river basin here with communities that are distributed throughout. And if you start to lose some of the pieces of the portfolio of populations within that system, depending on where that community is and depending on the extent to which that community is able to move to access fish elsewhere, a loss of population diversity, or the flip side, there being population diversity, can contribute or erode equity and access in these systems. Okay, but population diversity can be a blessing, and I think I've highlighted that, but it can also be a bit of a curse when it comes to thinking about mixed stock fisheries management. And that's because diversity complicates mixed stock fisheries. The most common example being that when there's variation among populations in their intrinsic productivity, mixed stock harvest rates that maximize yield from productive populations and the system as a whole can come at the cost of overfishing or potentially driving extinct the weak and less productive stocks, right? So this trade-off, this balancing act, if you will, between harvests and risk to population diversity is the classic weak stock problem in fisheries management. It leads to a tough balancing act between the two. But in addition to that very well-recognized challenge posed by among population variation and productivity, other dimensions of population diversity like richness, or particularly in this case, synchrony and recruitment can also complicate mixed stock fisheries. So here are a couple of figures that I'm going to walk through from the same mixed stock fishery simulations that I introduced earlier. On the left is biological risk. It's the color, the heat map, which in this case is the proportion or percent of populations that are at risk of being extirpated or have blinked out, as a function of synchrony along the y-axis. Again, this is the pairwise, average pairwise correlation and recruitment deviations amongst the populations in the complex. And then along the x-axis is richness, the total number of stocks that are in the system. And what we see is that higher stock richness and to a greater extent lower synchrony in mixed stock fisheries, which I showed earlier, increased catch stability, come with increased risks to biodiversity underpinning them. And that's because when dynamics are weakly correlated, some populations may, by chance alone, have a series of years of poor survival, while others are doing well. And so if the system is being managed on aggregate to maximize yield, then these stocks can be at those stocks that happen by chance to be experiencing a series of really poor years can be at elevated risk of extirpation. And so this can lead to a trade-off between risk and fishery stability, which is showed here on the right. And what's plotted here is a slice through the heat map on the left. So this yellow line here is across the full range of synchrony, but now it's plotting out stability and catch along the x-axis and risk along the y-axis. And what this highlights is that there's this trade-off between risk and stability in a mixed stock fishery that has what I'm calling no management control. And what I mean by that is that the goal, the objective in the simulation is just to maximize aggregate yield. So that's what's in yellow. But as you relax that, or as the hypothetical manager has more ability to allocate harvest differentially across stocks, which is as management control increases here in these colors, you start to have that trade-off be ameliorated, right? So to sum up the kind of first part of my presentation today, what I've hoped to try and make the point of is that different dimensions of population diversity and their benefits, which are well recognized, can make sustainable fisheries and mixed stock fisheries more challenging. And to understand and confront these challenges requires information that is often, but not always, hard to gather, particularly in large remote regions. Things like number, size, variation in productivity, run timing, etc. And even with that information, it also requires a management system that is responsive to and can operate, or at least be responsive to this finer scale understanding of diversity. So all of this means that often mixed stock salmon fisheries in large river basins are managed at an aggregate scale to some extent. Sometimes, but not always, without clear understanding of the trade-offs between harvest in those fisheries and risks to underlying diversity at the kind of the scale at which the fishery occurs. And that lack of transparency in decision-making can help inflame or lead to conflict around amongst resource users, and can undermine kind of the credibility and ultimately kind of the resilience and sustainability of the advice that's being provided in them. So this map here is just meant to kind of illustrate some of the large river basins across Western North America, all of which host large amounts of salmon population diversity, all of which are subject to some extent to mixed stock fisheries that occur either in the marine environment or the lower rivers. And they've all had to confront these trade-offs between harvest and diversity in different ways, shapes, and forms. Some have been more successful than others. But what I want to do for today is I want to hone in on a couple of these systems to the far north, the large river basins of Western Alaska and the Yukon, where these issues have been particularly acute, and where thinking about trade-offs between diversity and harvest have not advanced as far as they maybe have in other regions. These are big watersheds. The Kuskokwim River over here on the left is the largest free-flowing river within the continental United States. The Yukon River, which obviously spans both Alaska and the Yukon Territory, is a massive river basin. I believe it's bigger than the state of Texas or the province of Alberta. So these are big, large, relatively remote and sparsely populated river basins that have also historically supported some of the largest subsistence and certainly historically some of the largest commercial Chinook salmon fisheries in the world. They're also a region with relatively high food insecurity, where subsistence use or subsistence users and First Nations have relied on salmon to meet nutritional needs as well as cultural needs, in some cases for millennia. Both systems have seen declines in returns in recent decades. I think powerfully illustrated by this picture by Peter Mather of a Teslin First Nation elder standing in her smokehouse with a picture of the good old days when her smokehouse used to be full. Both of these regions have also seen growing calls to consider more than just fishery yield in the management decisions, including calls to consider explicitly or implicitly other objectives like protecting population diversity and ensuring equity and access to fish across these large basins with a lot of subsistence users. Both systems have Chinook salmon fisheries or Chinook salmon that are primarily harvested in lower river reaches in mixed stock fisheries, and they're managed based on kind of aggregate basin scale escapement goals. Or in the case of the Yukon, there's an escapement goal for the Canadian portion of the Yukon, which is what I'll be focused on for some of my presentation today up here in the top right. The challenge in both these systems when it comes to thinking about population diversity and then understanding trade-offs with harvest is that data collection is, as you can probably appreciate, difficult. And it's resulted in a kind of a patchwork of data across these sparse regions that hasn't been immediately amendable to understanding the extent of diversity, the benefits that come from it, and the trade-offs that may arise from it. Okay, so I'm going to start off the second act here with talking about Canadian origin Yukon Chinook. Our work there, which is very much ongoing, is really motivated, at least for the purposes of today, by these three overarching questions. The first is just simply how much Chinook population diversity is there? The second is, how does this diversity contribute to or influence aggregate run timing, run duration, and stability, interannual stability in run size, as well as harvest from it? How does this vary across the river basin? And then ultimately, to what extent does the diversity that we're able to characterize lead to trade-offs with harvest, and what does the shape and nature of those trade-offs look like? Chinook spawn in over 100 unique locations in the Canadian portion of the Yukon River, but assessment projects have been really kind of patchy in both space and time. But there has been a relatively consistent series of assessment projects at the border between Alaska and the Yukon. That's highlighted here. If people can see my cursor, White Rock, Eagle Sonar, and Sheep Rock. For about 2 decades, a little over 2 decades, both White Rock and Sheep Rock had fish wheels that were operated. That's what this picture is here to the left. And then more recently, there's been a sonar that's been in operation with a multi-panel gillnet test fishery. This has been used to enumerate daily passage of Chinook and chum later in the year into the Canadian portion of the Yukon. And samples of scales and more recently tissue have routinely been collected from fish to determine fish age. And that's what's highlighted over here in the right in this multi-panel figure. So what's going on here on the right, we've got years as facets to this panel. The gray bars that face upward is the distribution of daily passage over time by year. Then the red bars underneath are the distribution of either scale or tissue samples that have been collected over the duration of that run, with the number below them just indicating how many of those samples we've been able to go back into the archives, pull out, extract genetic material from, and ultimately assign back to one of the 8 geographically and genetically distinct subpopulations within the Canadian portion of the Yukon. And so that's what's highlighted here in these different colors. These are the 8 different populations that you'll be seeing on subsequent slides. These are still composed of dozens, in some cases, of individual spawning populations within them. But this is kind of the scale at which the microsatellites and more recently SNPs have been able to reliably discriminate amongst populations within the system. So what we did with this data is we then fit a multi-population, a Statespace multi-population run reconstruction model, both fitted to these daily estimates of total border passage by population, to ultimately estimate population-specific border passage and abundance back through to the 1980s. Then with that data, we then fit a multi-population age-structured state-space spawn and recruit model to those estimates of population level abundance, spawner abundance in this case, after we account for harvest in Canada, as well as aggregate harvest in the lower river and age composition to try and characterize and better understand what the underlying population diversity looks like in the system. Our first kind of key question was interest in how diversity contributes to variation amongst population and run timing and duration. That's what this slide here shows. So on the left, we've got the proportion of fish from a given population passing the border through time, right? So this is the average run timing and duration for each population. In this case, ordered from upstream to downstream. So Teslin and the upper main stem would be in the far upper reaches of the Canadian portion of the Yukon, which are actually the southern part past Whitehorse, almost into northern BC, whereas the lower main stem and White Donjek would be closer to the Alaska border to the north. What you see and what jumps out from this picture is that on average, typical duration of run timing, in this case at the border for each population is about 35 days, but on average across the entire aggregate, the duration of the run is about 75. So this suggests that that among population variation and migration timing results in aggregate return migrations that are about 2 times longer than would be expected if they were represented by a single homogeneous population. So this diversity helps contribute to the drawing out of the return migration, and by extension, potentially the benefits that are derived from it. Interestingly, we don't see what we often see in some other systems, which is that those populations that spawn the furthest upstream in the system return the earliest. In this case, it's kind of, if you squint, a bit the opposite. We think and we hypothesize this is probably being driven by variation among populations in the thermal regimes that eggs experience when incubating in spawning beds. Within this part of the Yukon Basin, spawning habitat ranges from really high elevation headwater streams with relatively cool thermal environments to mid-elevation kind of lake outlets with relatively warm thermal regimes. And those kind of map onto these populations, with those like the lower main stem and White Donjek spawning these high elevation systems without lakes, whereas those like the Teslin and the upper main stem spawning in relatively middle, low elevation lake outlet type areas. We also see on the right, these are just pairwise correlations and run timing across the stocks that they're on average, they're correlated, but that breaks down with distance. They're ordered in terms of kind of their course distance from each other. And so you get this kind of pattern of a degradation in coherence and run timing across populations as you move through space. The next question we were interested in is how does this diversity and this interannual variability in run size by population contribute to stability in the aggregate returns, and by extension, the kind of fishery harvests that integrate across it. So here on the left, I'm simply plotting out the coefficient of variation in run size for each population across the entire time series as well. So that's each population here for the first 8, as well as the aggregate realized CV at the bottom. In this case, based on 1,000 draws from the joint posterior distribution of run size from our spawner recruit analysis. So hence the uncertainty that's captured here. And what we see is that among population variation in the degree of interannual variation in run size averages somewhere around, say, 0.6. Whereas the aggregate CV is somewhere around 2.75, 2.3, sorry, 0.275, 0.3. So this suggests that kind of the portfolio effect, this kind of statistical averaging of weakly correlated dynamics contributes to an aggregate return migration that's about twice as stable as we'd expect if it was made up of a single homogeneous population. Something along those lines, right? And then on the right, what I've plotted out is a 10-year running average of run size, CV and run size, for 3 different locations within the river basin. So the black line is the lower river. This would be in Alaska. So this is across all of the Canadian populations. The lighter gray line is the middle river, and then the faint gray line is the headwaters. And this is a 10-year running average in the CV and run size up through to present. And what this highlights is that, not surprisingly, the more populations you have contributing to your run, the less variability there is from year to year. And that degrades as you move upriver. But also interestingly, for the lower river that's integrating across all those populations, we tend to see them become interannual variation to become a bit more variable than we have in the past, such that in recent years, there isn't as much spatial dampening of variation as you integrate across fewer and fewer populations as you move upriver. Okay, so the last question that we asked here in the Yukon, at least for the purposes of today, was really getting at this question of to what extent does underlying diversity lead to a trade-off with mixed stock aggregate harvest. So on the left here, I've plotted out intrinsic productivity, the Ricker-A parameter on the y-axis, and equilibrium size on the x-axis to give a sense of the distribution of these two characteristics by population within the system. You can see that these populations varied in productivity and carrying capacity by about 2- and 3-fold respectively. And then on the right, we can illustrate kind of what the inferred equilibrium mixed stock harvest and overfishing or extirpation risk would be based on these population characteristics across a range of fixed mixed stock harvest rates. So here on the x-axis, we've got an aggregate harvest rate. On the y-axis, the primary y-axis, we've got aggregate yield or harvest in the solid black line. This illustrates that harvest would be predicted to be maximized somewhere in the 55 to little under 60% range. And then mapped over top of that in the secondary y-axis is the inferred risk to individual populations of either overfishing or ultimate extirpation as a function of that mixed stock harvest rate. Illustrating here that if the system was being fished at a harvest rate that's expected to maximize yield over the long term under equilibrium conditions, you'd have to be willing to accept kind of the cost of overfishing about half of the populations. But there's a really relatively quite low, but not non-zero risk of some extirpation for the weakest kind of stock within the system. This also illustrates to some extent the asymmetry in the trade-off where relatively small reductions in harvest can yield relatively large reductions in risk, but I'll have more to say about that in the Kuskokwim in my subsequent slides here. I do have a lot more to say about the Yukon. This is an area where I continue to be fairly involved, but for the purposes of today, I'm going to switch gears over the Kuskokwim where we've kind of taken thinking about these trade-offs even further. So the last act, thank you for bearing with me, is Kuskokwim Chinook and Kuskokwim Chinook fisheries. Questions we were motivated by were very similar to those in the Yukon. First and foremost, trying to understand how much population diversity there is, the extent to which this diversity leads to trade-offs with mixed stock harvest. And we were really interested in how well alternative harvest policies might meet both harvest and diversity related objectives within the system. And then because of a lot of debate around some kind of alternative hypotheses about how much diversity might change or what's driving recruitment, we were interested in how well these different policies performed or how sensitive they were to alternative states of nature within the system. So here's a bit of an overview schematic of the Kuskokwim and the data landscape, if you will. These systems over here on the right, numbered, have been monitored in different ways, shapes, and forms over the past 40 years. 6 of the systems have pretty high quality weirs. Another 7 of the systems have a combination of different aerial surveys, which we had to kind of work with to expand to account for spatial and temporal extent of aerial surveys and assessment effort, which is details for another day. The weird systems also have information on age composition, and we had information on kind of system-wide aggregate harvest, which primarily occurs down here in the lower river near the community of Bethel. So what we did, and this was led by Ben Staten, who gave a presentation in this seminar series a couple of years back. At the time, he was a PhD student at the University of Auburn with Matt Catalano and is now with the Columbia River Intertribal Fish Commission. So Ben developed a Statespace, age-structured, multi-population spawn recruit model fit to all this data simultaneously that's organized in a way that shares information between populations by exploiting shared covariation in their dynamics. Now, this is an extension of the great work that Carl's done and was very much inspired by Carl's work, particularly, for example, in the Skeena. What we could do with this model is we could then try and squeeze kind of more out of the system in a way than had occurred in the past in terms of understanding individual dynamics. This here is just a bit of an illustration of what the time series of observations of spawner abundance and then the inferred kind of latent or true states were. Blue points here are observations. The black lines with the 80 or 90% credible intervals are our best estimates of true underlying spawner abundance. And what you can see, oh, and then they're highlighted based on whether or not they've been surveyed with LEIRs or aerial surveys. And what you can see is that if you squint across these populations, they show some, but not perfect coherence in their dynamics. Inference in missing years, so years without blue points, is based on the degree of shared pattern in years with data and overall returns. And then aerial surveys had greater uncertainty in our ability to kind of reconstruct those observations based on the fact that there's greater uncertainty in our estimates of spawner abundance based on those surveys. The picture that emerges looks something like this. Now these populations are color-coded according to their intrinsic productivity. Productivity ranged, well, you can see the numbers here in terms of the kind of the range of productivity that was estimated across these systems, and size. Some of these systems are quite small relative to the example in the Yukon and certainly other regions. We saw no real evidence of a relationship between size and productivity. I didn't mention that on the previous slide with Yukon Chinook, but we see a similar kind of pattern there. Relatively weakly correlated recruitment variation, and these populations here accounted for about half the production from the system. So we do have an index of total production based on a basin scale run reconstruction that utilizes a mark recapture study and other approaches to reconstructing total abundance in the system. So these populations here account for about half the production from the system. We can do something very similar to what we did in the Yukon here with illustrating what the kind of equilibrium inferred trade-off looks like between a mixed stock aggregate harvest, which is highlighted here in blue, and risk to individual populations here in red. In this case here, now what we've plotted out is risk, extirpation risk. And what you may notice if you were astutely looking at the previous trade-off plot for the Yukon is that because some of these populations are estimated to be much less productive than in the Yukon, and the distribution of these productivities is quite different, there's definitely not insignificant risk posed by harvest rates that would be predicted to maximize long-term yield. Now, the system, importantly, this system isn't managed with a kind of MSY maximize yield type policy. It's more of a subsistence fishery, at least in recent years, that has seen kind of long-term harvest rates that hover somewhere in the 40 to 50% range, but have varied considerably through time. Now, while an illustration like this can help us get a handle of what the shape and nature of these trade-offs look like, from a decision-making perspective, it's not super helpful because the system isn't managed based on, it's not managed through an exploitation rate type harvest policy. Instead, what tends to happen in the system is that large runs tend to see declining exploitation rates because of saturation in the capacity for subsistence users to access fish and exploit the resource. So what fisheries managers and stakeholders really wanted to know within the system is how well do kind of realistic alternative harvest policies meet both harvest and diversity objectives. And so to answer that question, what we did is we built a minimally complex closed loop simulation model for the system. I won't go into all the gory details of how we did this, but this follows kind of the classic closed loop simulation modeling type approach that many on here will be familiar with or have done many times. The basic ideas behind this, so that we have an operating model that simulates the true underlying dynamics of the system, both from a population and fishery perspective. In this case, our operating model, the biological component to the model is conditioned on that multi-population state-space spawner recruit model that Ben led the development of. We have a management procedure component which consists of an assessment submodel, which forecasts how many fish will come back in a given year. Again, matching the kind of the way in which business is done in the system. Those forecasts, of course, have substantial error associated with them. And then harvest control, which has two key levers. It has an escapement goal. This is a basin scale escapement goal, and then a target harvest in absolute numbers of fish above and beyond that basin scale escapement goal. Those are the two principal levers that management uses to support managing the prosecution of the mixed stock fishery in the system. And then the fishery itself is a mixed population fishery that occurs down in the lower river. Just trying to move something out of my way. And it, of course, has outcome uncertainty. Just because the system may want to target 30,000 fish does not mean that it actually ends up harvesting 30,000 fish. And so we conditioned our sense of that outcome uncertainty based on empirical observation for the system. We can then simulate the system forward in time, a number of for 50 years, over 500 Monte Carlo trials, and evaluate the performance of any given harvest control rule or harvest policy against a set of objectives. In this case, the consequences or objectives are estimated over the last 20 years of those projections. So the objectives are always a challenge. And I think for anyone who's been involved in this type of work, of which many of you have, defining objectives can often be one of the most challenging steps in an exercise like this. We were super fortunate to benefit from a number of workshops with fisheries managers and stakeholders over the course of several years. The core group is highlighted here on this slide. And really what it boiled down to were 4 core objectives that everyone, quote unquote, cared about. The first was harvest and meeting minimum subsistence harvest goals or needs. The second was predictability and stability in harvest and access to fish from year to year. The third, and this was an important one, was equity and access to the resource across the communities that exist within the basin. You may recall most of the fishery occurs in the lower river near the largest community, Bethel, but there are a dozen plus communities scattered throughout the rest of the system. There was a strong desire to have equity and access to fish across those communities. And then the broader group was very interested in ensuring that harvest policies don't jeopardize the underlying diversity within the system for many of the reasons that I highlighted at a high level earlier on in this talk. So what we did is we translated these objectives into quantifiable performance measures that are plotted out here. So for these heat maps that I'll be showing, we've got the 4 different objectives and their associated performance measures in each panel. Along the x-axis is the aggregate basin scale escapement goal, and along the y-axis is the aggregate harvest goal. So what we can do is we can explore all of this parameter space to start to get a sense of where trade-offs lie, right? And so this is what the picture looks like across all of that parameter space. Not surprisingly, harvest is maximized when the goal is high, the harvest goal is high, and the escapement goal is intermediate. Stability in harvest is highest when the harvest goal is relatively low and when there's essentially no escapement goal. And equity, which was characterized here by the chance of meeting tributary level goals. The idea here thinking that if individual tributary goals are being met, then that ensures that sufficient fish are making it back to each of the tributaries near the suite of communities that exist within the basin to meet their small subsistence needs. What you could see for both the chance of meeting tributary goals and the risks associated with driving the weakest populations extirpated, those were highest. The chance of meeting goals was lowest and the risk was highest when escapement goals were really low and harvest objectives were really high. And this is not super surprising, these kind of broad scale patterns. But what we could then do across this parameter space is we could overlay some very specific harvest policies that are kind of on the table that people are very interested in confronting with our knowledge about the system. And so here, for the purposes of today, I've highlighted 3 contrasting policies that essentially are trying to, they're weighting these objectives differently. So the first is a maximize mixed stock harvest, we'll call it an MSY policy. That falls at point number 1 on each of these panels. The second policy was a fixed harvest policy at the subsistence needs. These are the needs that are estimated to meet minimum nutritional requirements in the system as estimated by the Board of Fish in the state of Alaska. This falls in and around a little over 65, 70,000 Chinook on each year. And this policy said, well, let's just focus on meeting those needs and forget an escapement goal. So don't worry about not opening a fishery based on how many fish we might come back. Just allow those minimum needs to be met year in, year out. And then the third policy was meant to be a bit of a mix between the two, which is minimize risk of driving weak stocks to extirpation by putting the escapement goal high enough to ensure that, but then maximize aggregate yield after one minimizes that risk. There are, of course, many other potential policies that could be evaluated here, but for the purposes of today, this helps provide a bit of contrasting illustration amongst them. So what we can then do is we can plot out the performance for each of those while also capturing the uncertainty in performance across them, which is highlighted here with these gray error bars. Not surprisingly, harvest is maximized. We look at the top left with the MSY policy. Stability is maximized in the subsistence policy, which is 2, and that's the top right. Equity in access to the resource is similar between policy 2 and 3, which you can see down in the bottom left. And then really risk of driving the weakest populations to extirpation was highest, though still relatively low, depends on your perspective, for the MSY policy. There was relatively low for the subsistence policy, but still not 0, or by design 0 for the conservation first policy, if you will. Now, importantly, what this also illustrates is the strong asymmetry in trade-offs between harvest and biological or kind of social objectives, with the strength of that of that asymmetry in the trade-off dependent on the policy that's being applied. And so what I mean by that is simply giving up relatively small amounts of harvest result in relatively larger gains in equity or the probability of meeting those tributary goals and reductions in risk to diversity. So what I want to wrap up with here for this system is to highlight 2 kind of contentious issues that emerged in kind of our time and talking about and thinking about the system with those that depend upon it and are tasked with managing it. And these are kind of 2 key hypotheses or places where there's a lot of debate. The first was the potential for diversity and the underlying population diversity in the system to change over time. The idea that perhaps the small or weak systems today become the large productive ones of the future. And the second question or hypothesis was, what is driving recruitment variation within the system, and to what extent is it being driven by overcompensatory type dynamics or non-stationarity in environmental processes? And so these closed loop simulations were ideal for confronting these in silico. The idea with the changes in population diversity over time is that what if we allowed the individual populations to just simply shift who was a large or strong and productive producer and who was not. So here I've plotted out again productivity for each population against equilibrium size. That's what each of these points are. And then what we could say is, well, what would happen under a scenario where these get rearranged and the largest or most productive stock becomes one of the weakest or smallest stocks. And so they change based on where these arrows go halfway through the simulations. And this is meant to be kind of a toy illustration or example where the aggregate production from the system doesn't change, but who contributes to that production does. We could then drive this type of dynamics in the operating model behind the closed loop simulations and evaluate how well alternative policies perform given this alternative state of nature. The second hypothesis stemmed from the fact that variation in external factors like marine conditions over time can create the appearance of overcompensation in a spawn-recruit relationship, but for different causes. Right? This was hotly debated in the system, and what this plot here illustrates is how a stock-recruit relationship. In this case, these are simulated data from a Beverton-Holt type relationship with no overcompensation, but with cyclic variation in intrinsic productivity, which are highlighted up here on the right, how those types of dynamics can give rise to the appearance of overcompensation. The Kuskokwim has what appears to be a fairly strong overcompensation in the system, and there was a ton of debate about what the consequences of that are for the performance of alternative harvest policies. Right now, definitively answering the question of what's driving the dynamics is kind of a fool's errand, and we're highly unlikely to ever really fully resolve. But we can ask, how does our perception of the performance of harvest policies change if we have different underlying drivers of dynamics in the simulations? So last slide before I wrap up here. This here just captures the core results of these alternative operating model scenarios in terms of harvest policy performance. Now, in this case, I'm just illustrating the performance between two policies: the baseline the MSY policy and the conservation first policy, if you will, across these three alternative states of nature. So we have in gray what I've already shown previously. That's our base conditioning of the operating model. Blue is this time-varying Ricker dynamics, where strong producers become weak producers and vice versa. And then green is this time-varying Beverton-Holt type dynamics that give rise to the appearance of overcompensation when it isn't truly going on. And then what we're illustrating here is just two of the performance measures: harvest on the left, or the chance of meeting those tributary goals, the equity and access to the resource on the right, with policies 1 and 3, the pairs of bars together. Right, and so what these highlight here, if we start with the changes in productivity and size scenarios, that lower absolute harvest for each policy occurs if you compare 1 to 3, but you give up about the same amount of harvest by shifting from one to the other. Right, so that's what this number is up here, 20% or 26%. You give up kind of roughly the same amount of harvest, but what you gain in terms of reductions in risk to underlying diversity, which are highlighted over here on the right, is considerably larger. 84% under our baseline conditions, but 120% under this alternative operating model scenario. So again, similar reductions in harvest yield larger gains in equity, depending upon our kind of hypothesis about what the underlying dynamics are of the system. Now, if we move on to the alternative spawner recruit scenario, this is the green bars here. What we see is that absolute harvest is higher compared to our baseline scenario. And you have to give up almost nothing by going with policy 3, while still gaining significantly on the other objective in terms of reducing risk of weak stock extirpation. Though overall on aggregate, the chances of meeting those tributary goals are lower across the two policies. All to say, I know it's a lot to take in here at the end of the presentation. All to say is that what we see is that the relative performance of the policies stays the same, but the asymmetry and the trade-offs amongst them become stronger or more acute in the system. Okay, well, so thanks for bearing with me today. I'm going to just leave you with the same take-home messages that I started off with today. Again, not rocket science or really earth-shattering, but I think a nice illustration of some of these key points. And those are that large river systems host high salmon population diversity. We know that this diversity is important for a number of reasons, and it can be beneficial for a number of reasons, but it's also can be a real challenge to manage for in mixed stock harvest, right? And that's in part because it can give rise to these trade-offs between mixed stock fishery yield and overfishing and extirpation risk. Because of the history of monitoring these large river basins, it's often difficult to quantify both the extent and diversity within them and the magnitude of trade-offs in the mixed stock fisheries that harvest across it. But I'd like to think that these examples I've provided today help illustrate how modern molecular approaches or quantitative tools can be used to squeeze more insight out of existing data, can help characterize that extent and the benefits of diversity, characterize those trade-offs with mixed stock harvest, and ultimately help support greater transparency in thinking about trade-offs associated with alternative harvest policies. So thank you very much for letting me take the airwaves here this morning. And if you want to know more, always encourage folks to get in touch or take a look at some of the publications that have come from this work, or will be coming out hopefully in the not too distant future.
Oh, thanks very much, Brendan, for your really thorough and excellent talk. Time for a few questions. Just open it up here.
I'm above you, Randall. So I'm gonna grab the first one here. So over a long period of time, I've repeatedly suggested to ADF and G that they are already managing more with fixed exploitation rate than fixed escapement policies, even though they claim to be using fixed escapement policies. They don't actually do that on the ground. I'm really curious. So, and you showed that in terms of subsistence fisheries and that sort of thing, that the stable exploitation rate policies are way better than the ones that maximize yield for utility. I'm kind of curious how the ADF and G participants in the CUSC thing reacted to that suggestion that they just try to stabilize exploitation rates as a policy to deal better with subsistence issues.
I mean, it's a great point, Carl. I think that this work has helped further kind of illustrate kind of the utility of a more fixed exploitation type policy. And so, I mean, my personal observation is that working through exercises like this has helped further incrementally kind of clarify that for the powers that be and those that are ultimately responsible for managing the fisheries?
No, the question was simpler, actually. It was, did you get a hostile reaction from the ADF and G guys?
No, no.
No, you didn't?
No,
oh,
not
okay.
at all. No, no.
But we have in the past.
Yeah, okay. No, I would say we definitely did not get a hostile reaction in this case.
Right. We don't from the field managers. The guys sitting out in Bristol Bay and so on, actually running the openings. It's the guys in Anchorage that pretend that you have to do these other things. I'm sorry. Anyway, no.
Randall.
That was excellent talk and great research, Brendan. So yeah, I just wanted to ask about slide 21. Can you go back to slide 21, please?
Uh-oh.
Yeah. No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out something. You've probably already noticed this, but you got to be really careful when you use the term overfished here. Carl can tell you what the reaction was to his graph just like this in the SKINA panel report in 2008. This is overfished with respect to maximum sustainable yield. And many people in the First Nations, as well as in the fishing industry, got all huffy about the interpretation that they gave, which was more like, oh, overfished to the extent that they're about to go extinct, or that there's a very high chance that they're going to go extinct. So particularly because you're dealing with First Nations people a lot in Alaska, I think you may need to be very careful in defining what you mean by overfished here in this right-hand graph.
Thanks, Randall. I mean, it's an astute point. It's one that I have encountered in the past, and that sometimes using the term overfished creates more headaches than it solves in this context. So that's a great reminder. I mean, of course, like anything, it's all about how it's defined. And in the caption to this figure in the paper, it's clearly defined, but you're absolutely right. And the concept or the idea of being overfished relative to MSY is pretty abstract to many in this case. And you know, you raise an excellent point that I think has certainly been borne out in my limited experience in these cases.
Good, thanks.
Quick question, Brendan. In these systems, okay, unlike the sockeye, there's a lot of, like in Bristol Bay, there's a lot of monitoring, like test fisheries in the ocean and so on, run timing sort of monitoring and so on. you've simulated some fairly straightforward management strategies, but in practice in these river systems, is there enough monitoring to, let's say, implement them in practice to, like, that you can simulate in theory that, all right, they can actually assess abundance, and there's going to be some errors in abundance and so on, but in practice, in terms of genetic sampling, prior to the opening of a fishery, is there, let's say, the information systems in place, sampling systems in place to implement these policies effectively?
Great question, Murdoch. So both the Kuskokwim and the Yukon don't have anywhere near the same level of in-season streams of data that a place like Bristol Bay or Fraser, for that matter, have. In the Kuskokwim in particular, there's a lower river test fishery that's a fish wheel, or sorry, it's a gillnet test fishery. It's transitioning to sonar that provides an in-season measure of abundance. It also is right where the majority of the lower river mixed stock fishery occurs, including upstream of some portion of it. So the ability of the system to respond in season to information on run size and strength and then adjust harvest accordingly is quite limited. And so in the case of the Kuskokwim, really, the system in a simple sense is managed with a desire based on a pre-season estimate of abundance and indications early in season of how large the system's the run's gonna be, and a harvest goal. And in our closed loop simulations, we tried to kind of mirror that in a simple way while still capturing the historic deviations between the kind of target harvest that one's trying to achieve and what's actually realized across a range of run sizes. The Yukon is a little different in the sense that it's a much larger system. There's in-season genetics in the very lower river that help separate out and give an indication of run strength coupled with a sonar down near the Bering Sea in terms of how many fish are going to make their way up across the border. One of the reasons why I didn't show a bunch of closed loop simulations for the Yukon, which we are working on, is that it gets a lot more complicated in terms of kind of realistically simulating the dynamics of how the fishery is prosecuted and those in-season information streams are incorporated in there. So I don't know if that helps answer all of your question, but it's a bit of what the two systems look like.
Thanks, Ben. Are there some other questions? Comments?
Well, hearing none, I'll ask her another question. Brendan, you briefly mentioned this debate about the overcompensation in the Kuskokwim Chinook. And I remember that Brian Bew published a reconstruction of the abundances and productivities that showed an unusually strong stock recruitment relationship of the form of a Ricker bottle. And you're implying that that still has not been resolved, as whether that's an artifact of time varying productivities or whether it really is overcompensation. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, all I can really say is that you're right, Randall. It has not been resolved. There's still, considerable and vigorous debate about whether it's an artifact of the external drivers and dynamics of interannual variability and productivity in the system. I think at one point there was discussion about whether or not it was an artifact of the run reconstruction model itself. And I think that's been largely put to bed. I mean, you would know better than I with kind of the expert panel on the run reconstruction there about where you guys landed with that perspective. But I do think that coming back to the work I presented here today, Randall, that once we were able to illustrate that the performance of realistic alternative policies, the relative performance really didn't change in terms of what you'd select, it kind of put to bed to some extent the arguments that were occurring in the absence of kind of a quantitative illustration of the consequences of those alternative policies across those alternative states of nature. And that, I think, I think has helped push the dial in terms of putting this a bit to bed. Because at one point, people would say, we must manage for a really, really high escapement goal because we don't know what's driving the dynamics. And so what happened in the absence of this type of work is that hidden objectives and hidden perspectives become kind of entrenched in how people advocate for specific policies. And this helped to try and kind of better unpack and illustrate the kind of consequences with respect to them in the system.
You just said there's a whole lot of really bonehead mental models in the minds of biologists that haven't done careful population dynamics work. That was not a question.
You said it, not me, Carl. But hey, I mean, I fall victim to the same kinds of things sometimes, and like often sometimes in systems you think you think you kind of can work it through in your head about what the consequences might be of one set of assumptions or one set of drivers. And part of the value, as both of you know, with working through exercises like this is it allows for a much more kind of formal, transparent, and well thought out kind of confrontation of those assumptions in a kind of decision relevant context.
It's great. I hope the DFO pays close attention to you, because if there's ever a situation where this kind of analysis and your thinking is needed, is with that goofball wild salmon policy. It is as being implemented is a destructive mess. I don't think there's any other way to describe it.
Well,
no, go ahead,
Randall. I was going to say, I hope, I hope that in my tenure in the department, I have an opportunity to help positively contribute to changes and rectifying those places where it's falling short. I know that's a total weaselly diplomatic way to put it, but I will say I am thrilled with the opportunity that I'm now being presented within the department to help try and push some of these ideas forward. So time will tell, and we'll see where the chips fall at the end of the day. But I'm an inherently optimistic kind of guy, but I do think that there's reason for optimism and amidst a lot of real reason for pessimism across the board. Randall.
Yeah, well, you just said in passing there a moment ago, your eloquent statement of why this debate about overcompensation in the Kuskokwim doesn't matter much, that your alternative states of nature that you considered showed that it didn't matter much in terms of the objectives that you're looking at and the choice of management policies. How well accepted is that interpretation across not only ADF&G, but also the fishing industry and the First Nations people?
Like with everything, it takes time. And so where things are at now in the Kuskokwim is we did this work, and I purposely said closed loop simulations and not management strategy evaluation, because really the work was still not directly embedded in a decision-making process, a formal decision-making process. That is now occurring. So this has helped lay the foundation for a formal collaborative exercise in kind of charting a path forward for sustainable management in the Kuskokwim between largely the kind of intertribal fish commissions and ADF&G and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That this work has helped lay a foundation for. I mean, as you know, and many on the call will also know, another major concern that we didn't touch upon in this work is changes in the demography and demographic characteristics of Chinook salmon across this region through time. Changes in age and size and sex, which also can have important implications for expectations about harvest policy performance. And so that's yet another area rich for debate and argument that is going to be hopefully rigorously confronted in a formal MSE over the next couple of years.
Good work.